John Lennon was an English musician and one of the founding members of the rock band The Beatles. Lennon was born in Liverpool, England in 1940 and spent most of his childhood living with his aunt and uncle after trouble between his parents. As a child he learned to play the mouth organ and the banjo, and he was bought his first guitar in 1956. Lennon failed his GCE O-level exams and was accepted to the Liverpool College of Art, but was disruptive in classes and was eventually expelled from the college before his final year. During these early years, Lennon formed a band called the Quarrymen and began to put on local performances, and at the second of these he met Paul McCartney. Lennon asked McCartney to join the band, followed by George Harrison and Stuart Sutcliffe, and the four young men formed the Beatles in 1960. The Beatles then asked Pete Best to join them as the drummer, and were then booked for a 48-night performance in Hamburg, in Germany. Brian Epstein was made the Beatles' manager in 1962, and after Stuart Sutcliffe left the band and Ringo Starr replaced Pete Best, the band released their first single, Love Me Do, in 1962, and began to achieve mainstream success in the UK in 1963. The band's appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in the United States in 1964 began their breakthrough to international recognition, and the next 2 years were spent touring and songwriting. In 1966, Lennon was introduced to the drug LSD, and later that year Lennon made a remark in the British press at an interview that the Beatles had become bigger than Jesus. The album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club was released, and the increasingly complex lyrics contrasted with the band's earlier work. The band's manager Brian Epstein died in 1967. Lennon met Yoko Ono in 1968, and the couple were married in 1969. Lennon and Ono began to record experimental music together, releasing several albums. He left the Beatles in late 1969. His first solo album was released in 1970 to critical acclaim, and the second album, Imagine, in 1971. Lennon and Ono then moved to New York, and his speeches and anti-war propaganda drew criticism from President Nixon, who began efforts to deport him. He released more albums which were not well received, and he and Ono separated. He began writing and producing for other artists, and recorded more pieces for himself, achieving a #1 single in 1974. Lennon and Yoko Ono were reunited in 1975, and he then took a 5-year break from the music business. In 1980 he returned to music, releasing a further 2 albums, one released posthumously. On the 8th of December 1980, Lennon was shot 4 times by Mark David Chapman as he and Yoko Ono walked to their New York apartment. Lennon had signed a copy of his new album for Chapman earlier that day. Lennon died before medics could arrive, and his body was cremated without a funeral in New York, his ashes scattered in Central Park. And as a performer and writer, Lennon has 25 US #1 singles to his name. His legacy with the Beatles has led to the band being one of the most commercially successful bands in the history of popular music, with over 600 million record sales worldwide.